Oh, hey, everybody. So I'm obviously not at church. I'm not in town, Ashland, whatever. Really quick explanation as to what exactly is going on. About 11 years ago, I got diagnosed with an untreatable, incurable liver disease. And the thought back then was, well, we'll just see how it progresses, and hopefully it doesn't progress too badly. And for the last 11 years, it has progressed fairly badly. So recently found out that information out, and then even more recently, just in the last like week or so, found out that I needed to go to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota to see if we can't argue with that whole untreatable and incurable thing. So that's where I'm at right now. Like for all I know, at this second, I'm actually in like an MRI machine or something cool like that. So that's what's going on. Don't worry, it's fine. Everything's fine. But listen, if you guys are praying people, maybe you could do that, and that would be cool. And if you're not praying people, then I should probably, preach a sermon about that, so that way you are, because should be. So that's where I'm at. So here I am with the beauty of technology, talking to you on a screen. And I'm not going to preach a sermon about praying because I actually right now have to preach a sermon about a tattoo that I got. So you guys are probably aware I have a few tattoos. And back in the day, I wanted all my tattoos to have meaning. Like, I think when I was younger, I got this idea that, like, if you got a tattoo, then people would, like, come up and be like, hey, man, what's that tattoo? And then you could talk about it and, like, you could talk about the meaning. And so if it was, like, a tattoo that was, like, biblical or it was Christian or it was positive or whatever, like, you could have, like, a cool conversation with somebody about your tattoo. That was when I was younger. I thought that that's what it was, and so I had yet to learn that really all that's going to happen when you cover yourself tattoos is people will just make snarky comments about how you shouldn't have done that, unless you're at Taco Bell. At Taco Bell, everybody loves your tattoos, and they just all want to compliment them. So that's cool. If you get a bunch of tattoos, go to Taco Bell. It's an immediate self-esteem boost. But back in the day, I actually thought like all of my tattoos should be meaningful. I've really outgrown that. Like last year, I literally got a tattoo because somebody's apprentice needed practice, and she just did whatever she was going to do, and I was like, that's fine because, I mean, I've got a lot. Who cares? But back then, I wanted everything to be meaningful, so I thought about it, and I would, just think about it and pore over it, and I would think about, my favorite Bible things and my favorite Christian things, and I wanted that to be what I was covered in, and I came up with, probably 14, 15 years ago, I thought about, I wanted to get absolutely a tattoo for the absolute best story in the world. Maybe not best, but the coolest biblical story ever. Like the biblical story that would make the coolest conversation, that would just be absolutely the best. Like, I wanted to make just like the coolest story. And so I came up with it. And it was this part of the story of Samson. Now, Samson, you're probably aware because he's a really famous guy. Samson is basically like the Bible's answer to like Hercules or Thor or somebody else, like this huge guy who is like these superpowers. And I mean, he's basically just like a comic book character wearing a yarmulke. Like that's just what he is. And there's this particular story with Samson where Samson falls in love with this woman. She's a Philistine, and the Philistines were Israel, God's people's enemies. But anyway, he falls in love with this Philistine woman, and he wants to be with her, and he wants to marry her, and that's what he wants to do. Well, everybody knows this is the way it is, and he comes back to kind of marry her after being, off somewhere. And he goes to the girl's father, and he's like, "Hey, I'm ready to do this. Let's plan a wedding. Let's get married." And the girl's dad he has bad news. He says, "Well, I already married her off. I thought you were gone. I didn't think you were coming back. I didn't think you were serious. I didn't think this was really. I didn't think she was going to be Mrs. Sampson. Like that's crazy talk. You're a Jew. She's a Philistine. Like this is. I didn't think it was real." So he married her off, and so she's now unavailable. And Samson interprets this not as like an honest mistake. It's not, he doesn't think like, oh man, that's bad luck. Instead, Samson thinks that the man is messing with him. that the man is trying to get at him, that he's, trying to get under his skin, that he's trying to attack him because he's Hebrew, because he's Jewish. And so he takes complete offense, and he decides he is going to get revenge on this man and the people of Philistia in a very specific and creative way. So Samson goes out one night and he finds 300 foxes. Now, it boggles the mind how you would even find 300 foxes. I've had these foxes in my neighborhood. There's only like 5 or 6 of them. They're building a house now, so they're all gone. But the point is, foxes are shifty. They're hard to find. They're hard to grab. You can't really get them. But Samson not only grabs a few of them, but he finds 300. And again, I don't know how this next part works. Like, I don't know if he had this giant like cage or this giant pen or like how he did it. But he got the 300 foxes and he took them with their tails and he tied their tails together. So you have 150 tied foxtail pairs. Okay. So Samson takes all these foxes, 300 foxes, 150 pairs tied together with their tails, and he lights the tails on fire. The foxes freak out. He sets them down outside of the fields, like, olives and grapes and wheat and everything else, all the fields of the Philistines, and he just lets them go wild. And as the foxes freak out and run around and go into the fields, they catch everything around them on fire, and the fields burn to the ground, which, of course, is a catastrophe. Definitely for the foxes. That was not cool to what he did to the foxes. That's not a good thing. Don't do that. But also, it's a catastrophe to the people of Philistia. Now, that was their food source. They don't have any of it at all. So a lot of the men find out what's happening. They see their fields are on fire, and they come out, and they're looking for a culprit. And Samson's just there, and he's like, yeah, I'm the one that did it. And there's this big fight, and he kills a bunch of them, and then he decides that he's tired because catching foxes and tying their tails together is just, it just takes it out of you. And so Samson gets in this fight, and then he retreats, and he goes back to like this cave where he kind of just, I don't know, for lack of a better word, he pouts because he's missing his girl, and it's all a thing. Probably wrote terrible teenage music on an acoustic guitar or something. So the Philistines are not going to take this lying down, and also they're hungry. So they decide they're going to get revenge on Samson by getting at the Jewish people that are his people, that he cares about, that he's supposed to be judge over, that he's supposed to be the leader of, right? Like, he's supposed to help these people. And so they decide, well, look, we don't have any food. We don't have anything else. So let's go to the nearest city. It would end up being a place in Judah called Lehi. And they said, let's go to Lehi, and we'll just take all their food. And we'll just take their homes, and we'll just take their women, and we'll just do whatever it is we need to do. And they set up camp, and they just absolutely made life miserable, oppressing and stealing from the people of Lehi, which is obviously not a great move, but also wouldn't have happened if not for what Samson did, which helps explain the next thing. So the Jewish people look at this, the people of Judah, the people of Lehi, and anywhere surrounding, and they look at the whole situation, and they say, look, the issue is not even so much that the Philistines are attacking us. They're good. That's what they do. We've never liked each other. This is just what happens between us. The issue is that Samson keeps antagonizing them. Like that fox thing. That's the issue. So 3,000 Jewish people go to Samson. They know where he's at. He's in this cave. And they interrupt his, songwriting session. And they go in and they say, hey, look, man, like, because of what you did, because of your actions towards the Philistines, now they're coming after us. Like, that's what's happening now. Now they're taking our food, they're taking our homes, they're taking our women. They're just doing it like it's terrible. And you're not suffering. You've got this big cave. You can do whatever. You created a mess, and we're the ones that are having to clean it up. Like, that's not okay. And so Samson, he's like an 11-year-old, and he's like, well, they did it first. And the people of Lehi are like, right, okay, fine. You can think that if you want, but the reality is we are the ones who are suffering, so we need to do something. And Samson's like, look, I don't know what you want me to do. So they said, here's our plan. We're going to tie you up, and we're going to give you to the people we're going to give you to the Philistines. We're going to tie you up. We're going to give you to the Philistines. Whatever happens after that is y'all's business, but we want left out of this. And Samson, I think, probably thought it was a little funny because it's kind of a forward move by the people of Israel. And they ended up doing exactly this. Like, yeah, great, I'll do that. So he lets him tie him up, and they take him to the Philistines. And that's when the amazing part of this story happens, right? So the Philistines are there, like this whole army, and here's Samson, and he's all tied up. And finally, they can get their revenge on him, for this and other stuff. They can get their revenge on him, and he's unarmed. So what is he going to do? And the story goes that Samson ends up being filled with God's Spirit. And as the army is kind of approaching him, he breaks out of his bonds. And unarmed, he looks for a weapon. And that's when he finds, laying on the ground, the jawbone of a dead ass. And I just cussed, and that's the best part of this story. It's the jawbone of an ass. I could say donkey, but what's the fun in that? I'm just quoting King James English. You can't even argue with me right now. King James English says the jawbone of an ass. So that's what I'm going to say, because that makes it infinitely cooler. So he takes the jawbone of an ass, and he makes that into a weapon. And Samson kills 1,000 guys in battle. The mind boggles to even think about how this might have worked. Hand to hand, 1,000 guys he kills just over and over. Like, he killed 700 guys, and he still had 300 more. That's how crazy this was. And he did it all with a bone in his hand. Like that, not even a weapon, just a jawbone of, I'll say donkey now, the jawbone of a donkey. We don't want to go too far with the mild obscenities. That story is amazing. Like, that is the coolest story. There was a kid who used to come to church here all the time, and we joked about how this should be a movie, right? And then they made it into a movie, and I never saw it, and so maybe it was a bad idea to make it into a movie because I didn't give him my money. But regardless, like, this is the coolest story. And so, like, 15 years ago, on a big chunk of my leg, like my lower leg, I've got the jawbone of a donkey tattooed on me, and no one's ever asked, no one's ever said, like, hey, what's that? And then I can tell the story. Not even at Taco Bell. Nobody's ever done that. But if I'm telling you the truth, I sort of feel differently about this tattoo now than when I got it. Because when I got it, I thought, this is super great. This is super cool. This is a good story. I don't know, like, how much it's supposed to be, like, literal or figurative, or I have no idea. But it's a good story. So I just thought it was really great. But as the years go by, and the more I studied and learned and prayed and just lived my life as a Christian, the more I realized that, like, this is, if anything, this is significant for a different reason than I first thought. Because, like, okay, there is really, of everything I just told you, there is absolutely no way to ever consider that Samson is the good guy, right? Like, I'm not saying the Philistines are the good guy, but Samson is definitely not it. Samson starts this whole thing in a temper tantrum because someone else got to marry the girl that he liked. Like, that is not a reason to burn down everybody's crops. It's certainly not a reason for animal abuse, and it's 100% not a reason to harm innocent women and children, who needed to eat the food from those crops. Like, they had nothing to do with it. If he wanted to take revenge on the dad, okay, maybe that would have been somewhat reasonable, but that's not what he does. And by the way, we shouldn't be taking revenge anyway. But even if he did, like, you could understand, okay, well, that was that guy. But instead, he picks this whole fight. And the downstream effects of that is he ends up hurting other people, right? The Jewish people of Lehi in Judah, they were completely right. When they said, Samson, this is your fault. This is your bad. You're the one who did this. They are completely right in that. It's like, there's no lie at all there. He is the one who did that. And so, there's nothing real heroic about killing 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey either. Like, maybe it's fun. Like, maybe it's the kind of thing you'd see in a comic book or playing a video game or watching a movie or whatever. But there's nothing heroic about it. There's nothing good about it. And as Christians, okay, as people who understand that Jesus is, number one, our ethical example at all times, and number two, our reflection of who God is at all times, this story really becomes not only indefensible, but it becomes kind of reprehensible. Jesus shows us that morally this isn't okay. Jesus shows us that God would never have actually wanted this. Not a good story at all. If anything, this tattoo on my leg is now kind of a cautionary tale of A, getting dumb tattoos, but B, a story that we might think is good at first, but then isn't in hindsight. Of course, Samson himself is a judge of Israel. He was supposed to be a leader. He was supposed to be good, but the real tragic part about this story and really the entire story of Samson is that he was not just supposed to be a judge, he was supposed to be somebody who was set apart for God. He was called a Nazarite, which is just a fancy term for somebody who's set apart, somebody who's holy, somebody who's sacred to do a job for God. Now, the Nazarites had a specific vow that they took, at whatever point they became Nazarites. For Samson, it actually was taken when he was, before he was even born. His mom took the vow for him. And, as she was pregnant, she took the vow that her child would be this. But the Nazarite vow really boils down to three things. Number one, you're not supposed to eat anything from a grape, which it basically just means no alcohol. I don't know. There's not a lot of like grape salad going on in ancient Israel. It was basically don't drink wine. It boils down to. And so there's that. Don't eat anything from a grape. The second thing is you're never supposed to cut your hair. It's a sign. It's like an outward sign of your inward decision. Like everybody who sees that you have this crazy long hair, however it is, I've seen like his dreadlocks or whatever it is, you're never supposed to cut your hair, and that's just it. And so people can see like, oh, that's a Nazarite, look at how much hair that guy has. And the third thing is you're never supposed to be around a dead body at all. Like you're never supposed to touch a dead body. You're never supposed to be around a dead body. Like if you find a dead body, you're supposed to go find somebody else to deal with it. Like it's kind of that strict. And that's what Samson is supposed to be. And if you think about it, I mean, like, Samson's really not good at, like, forget being a leader. He's not good at being a Nazarite. He's not fulfilling his vow to God at all. Now, the first thing, I will give him credit. I want to be as fair as I can. There's no evidence, unless I missed it somewhere in the Bible, that he actually ever drank alcohol or ate grapes. Like, there's this one time, like, the closest thing we get about, like, what he eats is he eats, like, this honey that's being, in this, like, dead lion. And that's super weird and maybe would be a cool tattoo also. But he does that, but that's not grapes. That has nothing to do with wine or alcohol or anything like that. So I will give him credit. 1 out of the 3 he does well at. But obviously, like everything I just told in the story, he deals with a lot of dead bodies. Even if we just limit it to the story that I just told, okay? Like, he definitely touched the dead bodies of, the foxes that burned up. He definitely touched them. He definitely touched the dead bodies of the men he killed, either the initial time or with the 1,000. He definitely, like, not only is he not trying to avoid touching the dead bodies, he's creating the dead bodies in which to be touched. That is not good. So that part of the vow, he doesn't even care. He just, nope, that's not a thing I'm going to worry about. And then, of course, we get to the hair thing, which means we've got to talk about Delilah. So listen, I know when I first said Samson, like at least half the room in their mind said, oh, Samson and Delilah. Or you may said it under your breath, like, oh, Samson and Delilah. Like Samson and Delilah, like that's the story we all know. And the story we all know of Samson and Delilah, through art history, through different songs, through television, through movies, it's like this tragic tale. And I think one of the things about the Samson and Delilah story is the Bible says very, very little about Samson and Delilah. And so we can kind of impart our own thing. It becomes kind of like a Rorschach test of what we want something to be. It can be like a tragic love story, or it can be, this terrible betrayal or whatever. Most people say that Delilah is a Philistine, that she's one of the enemy, and the Bible doesn't say that anywhere. In fact, the Bible says the opposite. The Bible says that she's from this place that Israel had, so she's an Israelite. But regardless, it's this story that we sort of know in vague terms that we always try to impart our own meaning on. But if you look at what the Bible says in the story of Samson and Delilah, it's an interesting story because it's almost a place where if Samson had been doing what he should be, he's almost a victim, right? Like he knows the second part of his vow is don't ever cut your hair. He knows that, and he knows that this for him in his own specific vow that his crazy strength comes from that hair. Well, he and Delilah were together, and Samson clearly loves Delilah, and Delilah seems to be sort of fond of Samson, at least enough to be with him. But it's not the same feeling at all. And so the Philistines one day come to her, and she's not a Philistine, so they don't just tell her and order her what to do. They kind of have to be delicate about it because since she's actually Jewish, if they cross lines, then you could have a war, and they've got a Samson on that side. So they just say, look, if you hand him over to us and you figure out why he's so strong and you give us a chance to kill him, then you know we'll give you all this money. And the Bible tells us that Delilah is from, like, she's from the sticks. She's from way out, living in poverty, away from other people, living kind of in this valley. And I always imagine, think about it, it's like the darling girl in the Andy Griffith show. Like, she's coming to Mayberry, and she thinks Mayberry is the big town, right? Because where she's from, it is. And that's Delilah. Like, they have nothing. And so this bag of money, this massive amount of money, is just too much. And so she doesn't love Samson anyway. She doesn't care. And so the whole thing goes on. It's this whole long story. Long story short, she ends up figuring out how to cut, that it's his hair that is the thing, and she ends up cutting his hair, and Samson loses his strength, and the Philistines come and they gouge his eyes out and they throw him in prison, and that's almost the end of the Samson story. The point is this: Samson had a job to do. It's not just to be a leader. It's not just to be to be a judge, although he is that. Samson had a job to do, to be a man of God, a Nazarite, somebody who had taken a vow. He was supposed to be a man who would keep that vow and would live his life for God no matter what. And he didn't. I'll grant that, maybe he did for one out of the three parts of the vow, but he didn't. He ends up cutting his hair because, Delilah gets him to, and he ends up touching just all the dead bodies. I mean, he just doesn't. They don't even try with that. At the end of the day, Samson's sort of a louse. And I got to tell you, it's interesting, my relationship with Samson over the years, and especially as I preach sermons, as I've been preaching here for 15 years. Samson's one of my favorite stories. I love like the big, I love it the same reason I always go to see Marvel movies when they first come out. Like, I try to see those on opening night for forever, because it's just something, this larger than life guy who is, doing everything he can to do different things that no one else can do. The crazy feats of strength. The fox thing. Even the honey thing is the end of a crazy story where he's fighting a lion and stuff. And I mean, it's just this amazing thing. But yeah, he's kind of a louse. He's not a good guy. And I think for a lot of my life as a Christian, I thought, well, this is like a morality kind of play, and he's the good guy, and the Philistines are the bad guys. And in my younger years, that would have been the way that I understood the story. It's the way I think a lot of Christians understand the story, because it's natural for us to say, okay, well, that guy is one of God's people. He is in the Bible, and therefore he must be good, right? And then, there came a point, I ended up reading this book. I remember there was this book that I read 10 years ago or so, that was by this Jewish rabbi who laid out that, like, Jewish people don't think that Samson is a good guy because of all of the obvious ways in which he's not a good guy. Like, they see him more as a cautionary tale. They see him more as, what not to be. And I remember, like, being really hit hard by that, because it's kind of like somebody shows you something, and I knew that picking fights with people isn't good, and I knew killing people that are innocent isn't good, and I knew that getting revenge isn't good, and I knew that there was nothing of Jesus and his ethics reflected in Samson, and so it made sense that must be the way it is. So for most of my life, or a lot of my life, I guess, younger, I thought that Samson was a good guy, and then I kind of developed into just thinking that Samson was not a guy. And I know I preached sermons here over the last, decade where, just explain, like, hey, don't be like Samson. And I remember that was one of my favorite series. That was back in the day. I was like, don't be like that. That was it's a good idea. I like coming up with good ideas, but then I hate that I can't use them again because I already did it. Anyway, that's a total aside. This is a weird thing, though. This is weird thing in the book of Hebrews. So I've said for a long time that if I had to just to understand Christianity from one book of the Bible, from two books of the Bible, I would take the Gospel of John and I would take the New Testament book of Hebrews. Those are my two books. Like that's it. That to me, that is your nice handy summary of the Christian faith, and that's it. If I'd take one, man, oh man, it'd be so hard to not take John. But Hebrews is a solid 1B, if nothing else, right? And there's this piece of the book of Hebrews that is really, really fascinating and really, really good. And it really makes it's kind of what I think maybe Hebrews is known for with people. This is what we read in Hebrews chapter 12. This is what we read in this book. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. Okay. So Hebrews chapter 12 is the tail end of an argument, okay? And one of the things I always learned, one of the things I learned in Bible college is anytime you see the word therefore, you got to look what it's there for. It's a good play on words. But also it's true. Like if it says therefore, like it's you're bridging one to another. And the beat of this, right, is that we can live our lives of faith knowing that other people, this crowd of witnesses, which is kind of the A, it's A to B, because of this crowd of witnesses has shown us that they lived a life of faith, that we can live a life of faith. They're these saints, right? And they show us what life can be like, and they show us that they didn't give up and they persevered and they did all the stuff. They did all this good stuff, and because they did the good stuff, then we can do good stuff too, right? That's the book of Hebrews. And if you rewind in the book of Hebrews, in chapter 11, there's this part that I think is probably the most famous part of Hebrews where it's called the so-called Hall of Faith, right? Like it lists all these different people who do all these wonderful things. And, it's like, hey, because these people do these wonderful things in the Bible, then they are a crowd of witnesses. They are the ones who went on before us. They're the ones who testify to the idea that the Christian life is possible, that faith is possible. And because they did that, we can live our lives following Jesus, and being Christian. Got it? Good. Perfect. A lot of those people in the so-called Hall of Faith are exactly the people you would expect. Like there's David and, there's Moses and there's Abraham and there's just, folks that you would expect are the people that we should be following. But as you might have guessed, there's some other folks. Here's what we read in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. We read this. How much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the other prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. So when I was younger, I thought that Samson was a good guy. And then I sort of disabused myself of that notion, and I realized that Samson's not a good guy. And I think that's basically still where I'm at. But the fascinating thing about this whole idea is that the writer of the book of Hebrews is insistent that, as surprising as it might sound, Samson is part of this Hall of Faith. Samson is a saint who we should look to and say, well, what did he do that was right? How if he could do it, so can we. And I'll be honest, for a long time, I have really puzzled as to what that might be. Like, what was it that Samson did that was good? Because, I tell a story about the foxes and the jawbone of the donkey and the Delilah and everything. I mean, it's all terrible, right? Like, what could possibly be right about Samson? And I think I got the answer. Or at least I think I have an answer. I don't ever want to think that I have the answer. That would be wildly, wildly arrogant of me. But regardless, I think I have an answer, and maybe why Samson is worth considering, even if 90% of what he does is absolutely terrible. Okay, so the story we started with, the story I thought was so cool I had to get a tattoo to kind of memorialize it. This is the end of that story. In the book of Judges, chapter 15, we read this. Samson was now very thirsty, because he'd killed 1,000 men. Samson was very thirsty, and he cried out to the Lord, "You have accomplished this great victory by the strength of your servant. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of these pagans?" So God caused water to gush out of a hollow in the ground at Lehi, and Samson was revived as he drank. Okay. So remember that story with Samson and Delilah. Delilah cuts off his hair. They come in, they gouge his eyes out, they throw him in prison. This is the end of that story, which is actually the end of the life of Samson. This is what we read in Judges chapter 16 now. It says, "Half drunk by now, the people, being the Philistines, demanded, 'Bring out Samson so he can amuse us.' So he was brought from the prison to amuse them, and they had him stand between the pillars supporting the roof." A little bit later in the story, getting to the end, it says, "Then Samson prayed to the Lord, 'Sovereign Lord, remember me again. Oh God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my two eyes.' Then Samson put his hands on the two center pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, 'Let me die with the Philistines.' And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people." At the end of these two stories, so a couple of times in the life of Samson, Samson prays. And what I love about these prayers is that they are terrible. And I mean terrible with a capital T and a capital arable. It is the absolute, I mean, these are the worst. The first prayer is like, "Hey, God, hey, man, so I did this great thing for you. You shouldn't let me die because I'm super awesome." That's his first prayer. That's not a good prayer. If I'm preaching a sermon on prayer, because you guys are not prayers, we mentioned this before, that the first lesson is don't pray like that. And then the second lesson is don't pray like the other one, where he's like, "Hey, I want to get revenge. Would love to get revenge because these guys took my eyes out. And also, man, it'd be cool if I could kill all of them when I killed myself." So we have arrogant prayer and we have murder, suicide, revenge prayer. Those are prayers as rotten as Samson is himself. But he prayed. And I think there's something to be said for that. I really do. I think there's something to be said for the idea that at the end of the day, he did turn to God. Samson is maybe the worst example of a saint in the Bible. Like, he's maybe the worst example of what we should be in all of Hebrews 11. But he still is an example because he turned to God. And I think it's really important that we understand that God was there for him to turn to. I think we very often get this idea that, when we turn to God, like, we need to be good enough, and we need to be smart enough, or we need to believe the right things, or we need to, have done the right stuff in our lives. But Samson blows up all of that. Look, there is no defending anything that Samson is, anything Samson did. There's no defending any of that. We shouldn't ever try. But he turned to God. And that's a good thing. It's an example to us, because at the end of the day, there is a little bit of Samson in all of us. Like, I really hope that nobody around here is so filled with rage that you kill an enemy, or 100 enemies, or 1,000. Like, any enemy, don't kill people. But I mean, that desire to get revenge is part of us. That desire to do so much want something that we can't have, right? And the woman to begin with, or Delilah, whether to want someone we shouldn't have, or to want something we shouldn't have. I mean, those are universal emotions. It's like Samson is just these universal emotions just turned up to 11, right? Like, these negative traits just turned up to 11. This is what it would look like. Samson is what it would look like if we live by pure anger, or we live by pure lust, or we live, by pure impulse, right? Like, that's Samson. He is everything we should not want to be if we as people want to be like Jesus. And yet, he turned to God. And I think it's really, really important that we recognize that that's how God is. The writer of Hebrews said, look, there's this group of people, and they show us what faith is. We are surrounded by a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, he says. Because of that, let us run our race. Let us follow Jesus. Okay? If they can do it, we can do it. And Samson is like the most extreme example of someone who, well, if he can do it, anybody can, because he's the worst. He's the worst story. He's the worst example. He's what, however this is. If Samson was a real person, and we're supposed to take this literally, he's the worst guy you would ever meet. If it is just like an allegorical, interpretive story or whatever, it's the worst one of those, right? Like, this is just a tragedy. And yet, if the story tells us that God listens to Samson in his terrible praying, well, then God listens to us when we pray also. That's the importance of these stories. That's the importance of the scriptures. Really, the scriptures are inspired by God to teach us how we follow our lives, how we can live, how we can move forward. And Samson shows us that, man, even at our worst, God is still there when we listen. Or God is still there to listen when we turn to him. Even at our worst, God is still there when we turn to him. This morning, our first week of our series called Surprise, I'm a Saint. And for the next, I think it's 6 weeks. I don't remember how many weeks it is, but for the next however many weeks it is, we're going to be looking at the book of Hebrews chapter 11. As it turns out, Samson is not the only really surprising person. He's not even the really surprising person in the story, in the passage we read. There's another guy in that passage that we're going to cover in a couple weeks. But the book of Hebrews chapter 11, it's filled with surprising examples of faith. People we never would have expected to exist as faithful people. People you would never think, oh, that's a saint. That's somebody to follow. But what we find is that we can find inspiration. We can find hope. We can find guidance even in the worst people in the scriptures. So this morning, as we talk about Samson, the worst person in the scriptures, we learn this valuable lesson. When we turn to God, he is there no matter what. When we turn to God, he is there no matter what. The musicians are going to come forward. They are going to sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week to take God up on this whole offer of faith. The Bible teaches that we repent to be baptized. That sounds like two things. It's really just one. It's us saying, I want things God's way, not our way. Something Samson really struggled with. In repentance, we change our minds. We change who we are as people. In baptism, we are aligning ourselves with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Just as Christ was dead and buried and raised, we are dead and buried and raised metaphorically, and we join our hearts, souls, and minds forever with him. We are given his spirit. We're forgiven of sin, and we're his. If you've never made the decision, I'm not here to talk to you, but I will be back in a couple of days. Anybody can talk to you. Let's do that. If you're an immersed believer in Christ, looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect. We want to call. We want to cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up. But we do it, and we want to be people who turn to God, whether we're good, whether we're bad, whether we're in between, whether we're having, praying well or praying terribly. We want to be people who turn to God no matter what, trusting and believing that he is there no matter what. As we stand and as we sing.